I was intrigued by the Magic of Scheherazade from the first time I laid eyes on it, not just because of the interesting setting or nice pixel art, but more so because it piqued my curiosity. I couldn't quite grasp how a game could possibly succeed at being both a competent action RPG and a turn-based one at the same time, yet here one was right in front of me. You play as the descendant of a powerful magician named Isfa, who saved the world from certain doom at the hands of a demon horde long ago. Many years after a prosperous and peaceful era in Arabia following Isfa's victory, a jerk named Sabaron decided to let all of the demons out again, and as the only blood relative around, your job is to defeat them and put a stop to his evil plan. The kicker is that you have a bad case of amnesia and have lost all of your incredible cosmic powers, but thankfully there are many folks along the way that can fight at your side and help you on your quest to restore peace. When you first begin the game, you get to select a character class. This isn't like your typical adventure where you choose one and are stuck with that decision for the rest of the game, for better or worse. You can actually switch between them at any time for a small fee, which I hadn't experienced before. Each type has their costs and benefits, and most of the time I journeyed as the fighter, since I always tend to lean into the best option for balanced offense and defense when I'm on a first playthrough. I also love the idea of having more combat reach, and when the manual says that the sword is as effective as one twice as long in a fighter's hands, they weren't kidding. The other two classes didn't seem like good starter choices for me, but I eventually learned to embrace the magician too. There are points in the game where you won't be able to progress unless you swap to a specific class, but the magician in particular is incredibly overpowered down the line. While some sword upgrades can give the fighter some projectile reach beyond his little poke, with the rod, the magician has rapid-firing, screen-crossing blasts of magic that are just simply not even in the same league as the other options. This is especially apparent when you compare it to the Saint's Wiener Sword. That class's best feature is not losing health when crossing damage zones. Wow, big deal. The 2 seconds it takes me to walk around these or jump over them doesn't even begin to justify playing as the Saint when I can have magical explosions or a longer sword that repels enemy fire. The only downside to the magician's rod was how noisy it was. The sound effect they used was so extreme that it feels like it should have been reserved for something more substantial than a little energy ball shot, and it plays every single time you fire. I suppose the ear pain is a small price to pay for that kind of power. All of the action-based combat takes place while you're exploring around. Enemies pop up to pick a fight with you, leaving you with the choice of either running off the screen to escape or taking them down with the weapons I just mentioned. The same thing happens in dungeons or caves as well, but no matter where they take place, these battles predictably occur on the same screens. If you've ever played Willow on NES, it's very similar to the overworld fights there, but without the very earth beneath your feet coming alive with the battle transition. I found fighting these encounters fun for the first while, but eventually they started feeling kind of boring. My biggest issue was the lack of different monsters to take on. As you go from chapter to chapter, you'll see the same fighters, the same insects, the same antlions, and the list keeps going. They're obviously stronger the further into the game you go, but their patterns and movements never really advance beyond the first time you see them. And you'll likely see 90% of them in the first few hours of the game. Given how often you have to battle this way, more variety would have been very welcome. There's still plenty of incentive to wreck everything in sight, since you do gain experience points with every kill. An aspect I found very intriguing was the level cap in each chapter. This meant that there was only so much I could do to grind up before I had to face the music and try my hand at the next boss in line, and I actually really liked this. It kept the stakes nice and high since I couldn't just endlessly grind to make the game easier for myself, and the difficulty never even came close to the point where I was craving an edge in battle from a good grind session. I also appreciated that every player was afforded the exact same experience. In my first playthrough, I did a lot of wandering and backtracking while trying to figure out where to go, and usually hit the level cap before I was done with an area. Reaching it at least gave me an excuse to avoid some of the monotony of the enemy encounters for a while. If all of this action wasn't enough for an RPG on its own, there's also the entire second battle mode to be found in turn-based encounters. These provided some much-needed diversity and showcased some really cool-looking enemy designs. The Best Smile awards have to go to Amories and Corsa monsters, but the entire monster roster felt like a set of familiar strangers. You've likely seen similar faces in other games, but none of them really behave how you might expect them to based on those experiences. Every new monster felt like a wild card, and I enjoyed watching and learning what each new type did, or how their strategies changed when they were in cahoots with others. Even though I really liked the turn-based stuff, there was one glaring drawback. These battles don't really offer any exclusive benefits over the real-time action combat I just mentioned, and for this reason, they eventually started to feel like a burden because of how drawn out they are. Their pacing is snail-like, so after I had my fill of destroying a bunch of enemies this way, there was nothing encouraging me to bother with them anymore. An even bigger deterrent was that towards the end of the game, I was coming up against some really nasty monster squads that are very tough to defeat. They heal themselves constantly, they can unite their attacks to release devastating blows on the party, or they can affect you with statuses that shut off your ability to use certain moves or magic. Some of these effects cause your party members to transform into adorable things, but even if becoming a cake or a hamburger was endearing in the moment, the potential of being whittled down to nearly dead wasn't worth it. I'd usually end up running instead of engaging, and I was actually pretty impressed at how often running worked. Other RPGs seem to have a much higher failure rate for it, but I think I was able to escape without a scratch about 95% of the time. I wholeheartedly appreciate what they tried to do with these turn-based battles. A lot of thought went into them, and they can get pretty involved and strategic, especially deep into the game. You can choose to fight melee style with either the sword or the rod, in addition to using any of the defensive or offensive magics you learn by leveling up. There are quite a few of these to wield that can exploit enemy susceptibilities, and even more elaborate still were party formations that you can make with other members that you collect along the quest. Before starting a battle, if you picked a certain combination of allies, you had access to collaborative magic that could potentially deal serious damage. It's really cool how many different ways you could approach this combat style if you wanted to spend the time fighting this way, but honestly, I felt like it was way too deep for this game. If these encounters had offered something special beyond the usual money and experience points, they might have been more alluring to invest my efforts in. Without something to set them apart though, the slow pacing just didn't feel worth the time sink to me. Especially when I could go bop a few enemies in the field and get the same thing out of it for way less effort. As a quick aside, I was very grateful for how little it actually cost to cast magic, even those big spells that are exclusive to ally formations. The ones I used the most often were some of the lightning and fire offensives, as well as Pampoo, the small heal. Pampoo is one of the first spells you acquire, and it surprisingly only costs a couple of MP to use. Even near the beginning of the game when my MP pool was tiny, healing up didn't feel stressful to me whether I was in battle or out exploring. Even some of the bigger and more potent magics didn't sap my MP meter completely dry, which directly translated into a happier me. I actually felt comfortable and motivated to experiment a little bit with this system, rather than feeling restricted by it. So many games I've played put up huge barriers in front of using magic by jacking up MP costs or making magic restorative items rare, and the Magic of Scheherazade was such a breath of fresh air comparatively. I thought it was all designed considerately, and it was awesome not feeling punished for wanting to use magic for a change. Now, onto those battle companions I mentioned. You begin the game with one friend named Hungrygoriya who serves as your guide, and you'll also acquire quite a few more along the way. Everyone joins you for plot-related reasons, but outside of initially locating them or having them help you through some kind of obstacle, many of them eventually cease being useful. There are always those turn-based battle party formations that they can participate in, but from the full roster of allies to choose from, I only opted for 2 or 3 of them consistently. I stuck to some of the beefier physical fighters that had some interesting magic, but the majority of my group with less compelling movesets stayed on the sidelines. For all of the work that went into developing such a large number of comrades, I would have liked to see them integrated into more parts of the story, or alternatively, even see a few of them excised to focus on fewer with more robust special magic or battle moves. As it was, my party felt a bit diluted, and many companions who could have been cool just faded into the background after their time to shine in the story was finished. The ones I did rely on were great, but this aspect seemed to miss the mark as a whole. Overall, the graphics felt above average for the NES. The color palette was nice and bright, with some of my favorite places being the outdoor forested areas. I loved all the greens and blues in these scenes, though I did appreciate the occasional change of scenery in wintry or desert areas. A huge standout for me were the character portraits. These appear during conversations with plot-relevant people, from merchants to the folks you recruit to your party. I especially loved the shopkeepers that would get progressively more angry when you try to barter too much, but they were all nicely detailed. The main character sprite was well animated, and I enjoyed his costume changes throughout the game. Many of the allies unfortunately looked like a bit of a jumbled mess. I couldn't often pick out many of their traits, and I also couldn't figure out why so many of them were huge compared to others. They looked especially ridiculous in the menu, where they were shrunken down to an unrecognizable form. On the other hand, the townspeople looked great. I loved their little outfits, but moving around them was occasionally troublesome. Because they were so big and some of the cities were a little bit cluttered, I got stuck behind NPCs a lot. Thankfully, there is a jump button to escape, but I didn't appreciate getting cornered by things that didn't make physical sense, like my character's foot getting stuck on someone's head, for example. Similar to what I experienced with the action-based enemies, unfortunately, after you've seen one town and its residents, you've pretty much seen them all. One very unfortunate choice in the visual department was the overuse of screen flashing. Lots of games are guilty of this when you win a big fight or when a character dies, but the Magic of Scheherazade seems to dial this up to 11 to the point where it's simply unreasonable. I was playing the game during daytime hours in a bright room, so it wasn't terrible, but I'm sure that my retinas would have been completely seared off if I'd been playing in the dark. If you're sensitive to this sort of thing, this might be important to know before heading into this adventure. In terms of the music, the entire soundtrack is amazing. I've listened to it fairly regularly since I finished the game, but I think my very favorite was the song that plays the first time you pass through the time door. It has this somber hopefulness to it that I really seem to gravitate towards in video game music. A close second is the turn-based battle song that got me feeling pretty hyped up to beat down on some not-so-innocent wildlife. I think the best way to describe most of the tunes here is flavorful and well-themed given the quest's unique setting. Some of the songs definitely have a good amount of Middle Eastern flair, and I can't think of anything else on the NES that sounds quite like it. And that's a good thing. Generally, the game's structured into chapters with clear beginnings and ends versus being a huge wide open world to undertake. In each stretch, there's usually a friend or two to recruit, a special item to track down, and also a wise man to find before felling a demon and moving on. I thought this might start to feel stale pretty quickly, but I ended up being pleasantly surprised at how engaging the story stayed from beginning to end. New chapters put just enough of a twist on the same kinds of goals, keeping things varied but familiar at the same time. I felt like the game moved through its motions smoothly. I ran into maybe one or two sticking points where I wasn't totally clear on how to progress, but the majority of the hints you get from the residents of this world were decently translated. I mean, at least they got their points across well enough, even if they weren't the most eloquently written. On the topic of the translation, I should also take a moment to mention the boss fights here. Knowing how to approach them often had a lot to do with how closely you paid attention to the messaging from NPCs, because you just couldn't bust in there and bludgeon them to the afterlife like you sometimes can in these kinds of games. I kept a pen and paper handy to jot down some notes, but even still, figuring out what to do was sometimes out of reach for me. Truly, these were some of the most unconventional fights I've ever dealt with. They all require something inventive from you, and for the sake of keeping this review spoiler-free, I won't say much more than that. All I can insist upon is that you take some notes, so you don't end up with your back against the wall when the time comes to face off with Sabaron's pals. In terms of the exploration itself, there's quite a lot to take in. You'll get to visit several climates that do a nice job of keeping that visual experience engaging, and some of these even affect your character. Too much heat or cold can sap your health, which I thought was a pretty neat addition. I was a little disappointed that there weren't too many secrets to speak of, at least not ones you got to locate for yourself. The party member you start the game with has this nasty habit of telling you where all of the hidden staircases are. On one hand, I didn't mind this in the latter, very expansive overworlds. Revealing a staircase with the open spell does cost MP, and I like to hang on to my consumable resources if I can help it. On the other hand, making progress this way felt a lot less satisfying and also made aspects of the game too easy. I grew up burning down every bush and blowing up every wall in The Legend of Zelda, so it might be obvious that I don't always mind a good mystery and being stuck for a while. I enjoy taking notes and making maps, and being told directly where to go kind of diminished my sense of wonder in this game by a fairly large margin. Not having the chance to get excited about a suspicious-looking tree or a weird dead end did suck some of the fun out of this one for me. Something I found a bit strange was how time travel was used as major plot fodder. Each chapter sees you moving backwards or forwards through time, but I'm not sure why they chose that as a narrative device over other options. Apart from meeting up with important people, finding key items, or occasionally planting special seeds in one of the other time periods, anything you do in one era never affects the others. There's no neat ripple effects or any sort of interconnectedness that's relevant to the character or story development whatsoever. And the same things could have really been accomplished by having the journey wind through a couple of towns in the same time period instead. I suppose having time travel as a heavy focus does make the Magic of Scheherazade storytelling unique compared to other RPGs from the time, but I felt like there was a missed opportunity to do a little bit more with it. One complicating factor is that every town has a different set of amenities available, so you might need to write down where you can heal up or buy supplies. There was actually a quirky thing related to this that got on my nerves. At the start of a new chapter, I'd end up set down in the middle of nowhere without the opportunity to get a password right away. The only way to get a code is to speak with someone at a mosque, but occasionally the town nearest to my new location didn't have one, forcing me to go out searching for one that did. This might just be a personal gripe, but I really didn't enjoy the risk of roaming around in a brand new area after finishing a boss fight. When you die in the Magic of Scheherazade, you can always continue at the expense of losing a portion of your money and getting relocated back to where the chapter starts you off. While it's nice that there was no possibility of getting bumped back to a previous segment if I died before finding a password, I was way more worried about my NES freezing up before I had the chance to do so. This cartridge locked up on me fairly regularly for reasons that I can't explain, and because of this, the sense of accomplishment I felt after making solid progress was sometimes dampened by my anxiety in trying to find a mosque. I guess I've been kind of spoiled by other games that immediately grant you that sense of security, but it does come with the territory of playing on original hardware. The Magic of Scheherazade was an awesome time. It has a distinct setting with compelling gameplay features like its character class swapping, the duality of its combat, as well as a solid story premise. All of these things elevated the experience above many others I've had on the NES, though I can't help but come away from all of it wishing a few things were different. Incentivizing the action in turn-based battles differently, as well as adding more utility for the companions you find, would have drastically improved the game for me. But even just as it is, it excelled in many ways. It's elaborate, well beyond the scope of games that only focus on a single shtick, and I'm simply in awe of what the developers endeavored to do and executed so successfully. While it's not the very best of the best experience I've had on the NES, it's certainly up there as a wonderful way to spend some memorable time gaming.